talking to you about what if we change the narrative about conservation. I want you all to please close your eyes for me for a minute. Just relax. Imagine you're looking out over a desert. There's just sand. It's dry. And you remember that a few years ago, there used to be a forest there with big trees, lots of animals, birds, butterflies, insects. You take a deep breath and you swallow and you realize you're very thirsty. And you remember that there used to be an amazing spring, cool and refreshing, that used to run through the forest. And you used to go and drink from it and collect water from it. But now it's gone. How do you feel? Are you feeling a little bit anxious? A little bit sad? How many of you have noticed a change in nature in the last 5 to 10 years? In the area, even if you live in a city, have you noticed a change in the weather patterns, a change in the rainfall, a change in the size of forests, a change in the size of parks? I'm sure every single one of you have noticed a change. And if you don't feel sad or distressed looking out over that desert, you really need to. Because if we don't change the narrative about conservation very soon, we are going to have nothing left. The traditional narrative about conservation has been about keeping people from nature, putting up fences. It's all been about prohibition, restriction, and protection. And we need to change that narrative. It's all been about, you can have conservation or development. You can't have conservation and development. But what if you can? And we really need to start thinking that we can. Over the years, we've been increasing the number of protected areas in the traditional narrative. They've been increasing steadily over the years. Yet at the same time, biodiversity has been declining at a rapid rate. Every year, there are more and more species disappearing. And don't get me wrong, the traditional narrative still has a place, and we do need to still have traditional protected areas, but we need to have a suite of options. We need to be creative and innovative in combining conservation and development, especially in Africa. The traditional narrative is very much a Western concept of conservation. The IBIS in 2021 found that 77% of land has been altered by humans, so directly impacted by human activities. 87% of our oceans have been altered by humans. I want you to look at those figures again. 77% of land and 87% of the ocean have been impacted or altered in some way by humans. And this has resulted in approximately 83% of mammal biomass being lost and 50% of plant biomass. And that is with all these efforts that we are making in terms of the traditional narrative. This is what we have lost in the last few decades. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is often one of the definitions of insanity. So I want to ask you all, if we carry on declaring more and more protected areas with the traditional narrative of conservation, does it mean we are all insane? Or certainly the conservationists amongst us? I really think, looking at those figures, that something has to change. We have to be more innovative and creative. With conservation, there are numerous benefits and costs. There are costs for people living with wildlife in terms of loss of access to land for alternative uses, loss of life, loss of crops, loss of livestock, and we need to account for those costs and ensure that the benefits that we are generating from conservation outweigh those costs. When I did my PhD research, I started in about 2008. I was looking at the socioeconomic impact of tourism and conservation on rural communities in 6 southern African countries. I interviewed nearly 2,000 people, but I started in Malawi. And the first week we were there, I arrived with this very much traditional narrative of conservation. I used to think, how can people kill elephants? You hear these stories, communities killing lions, killing elephants. How can they do this when they are just these beautiful animals? And in our first week, we arrived at this house where there were 5 young children playing in tattered clothes with no shoes. And the elderly woman who came to meet us was their grandmother, and she was their sole caregiver. We started the research, the survey, and she answered all the income and expense questions. And then we got to the human-wildlife interface questions. And she became a bit sad, and she started telling us a story about how a few months back she had just harvested her entire maize crop. And she had it inside the house with her, and they were sleeping at night. And she heard an elephant bull outside, trying to push down her reed and thatch house to get to the maize. So not only was their food for the next year until the next maize harvest at risk, so were their lives. And I realized right then that I too would kill that elephant. It's very easy to have a traditional narrative of conservation when you have a fridge full of food, a bank account with money in, a salary, safety. There are only benefits to conservation. But we cannot be so short-sighted and narrow-minded to think that there are not extensive costs for millions of people in Africa. I'm sure many of you know the saying by Peter Drucker, you can't manage what you don't measure. At the moment, we don't understand the value of our natural resources. We don't account for them, we don't include them in decision-making or policy, and that has to change because the values are massive. At the African Leadership University School of Wildlife Conservation, we have been doing research on the wildlife economy and how to unlock and grow this economy. There's one definition of economy, that it's the management, the sustainable management of available resources. And that's what we need to do. We need to sustainably manage our wildlife. And this research has really shown massive value. And I say that as an economist, I've been quite despondent because the data is very incomparable. It's outdated, it's incomplete. It's the worst nightmare for an economist. But even with that data, the figures have been massive. And the definition that we use for wildlife economy is that creating value from wildlife, and by wildlife I mean plants and animals, marine and terrestrial, that aligns with conservation objectives and delivers sustainable growth and economic development. So we can have conservation and development not being mutually exclusive, but rather intrinsically interlinked. So we look at what we call the big five of the wildlife economy. The first being ecotourism. Then we also include hunting, wildlife ranching, carbon, and forest products. In terms of ecotourism, in Rwanda, in terms of the tourism benefit sharing program, 2.85 million was shared with communities in 2019 alone. And in Uganda, approximately 10 million has been shared over the last 15 years through their program. These are just benefit sharing from one wildlife economy activity. Over and above that, you have the employment in tourism, the activities, the accommodation, the food, the transport, all of these additional values that are often not accounted for as being completely dependent on nature. In terms of fisheries, which fall under hunting, because essentially fishing is the hunting of fish. In Mozambique, between 500,000 and 1 million is generated per year from recreational fishing, and in 11 West African countries, 152 million is generated annually from recreational fishing. And then wildlife ranching, which is the breeding and sale of game in South Africa, about 56 million is generated annually, and Namibia 23.7 million. So this is the sale of meat for consumption. And is a really important point because we have massive issues in Africa with bushmeat, illegal bushmeat. And wildlife ranching as an economic activity can provide this legally and in turn create employment and revenues and taxes. And then the biggest activity is non-timber forest products, mostly unaccounted for and not included in policy and decision making. And argan oil, how many of you have heard of argan oil or use Moroccan oil in your hair? I'm sure many of the women here. Earns approximately 32 million annually and supports 2 million people. It is the most expensive edible oil in the world and is endemic to Morocco and a bit of Algeria. And in Nigeria, forest products support the livelihoods of 40 million people. So if there were no forests, how would these people survive? And then in Ethiopia, don't know about you, but I'm a big coffee fan. Arabica coffee, indigenous to Ethiopia, is grown by 4 million smallholder farmers and employs 15 million people along the value chain. And that's an important big fact about the wildlife economy, is it has massive value chains and multipliers that go beyond just the product. And at the moment, we're not taking advantage of those as a continent. We are mostly exporting raw products. So we really need to get entrepreneurs and innovative people creating this value addition so that we can earn more revenue. Ultimately, we need to mainstream the narrative of conservation into everything. We need to account for the costs of business on nature, and we need to account for the benefits that nature is giving business. It is a key growth opportunity for Africa. We have a comparative advantage. We are the only continent left with an extensive mass of wildlife in terms of plants and animals. We don't want to look back in a few years and be rewilding as many parts of the rest of the world are doing. Ultimately, we need to start nurturing nature. To nurture means to help something to grow. And so by seeing nature as an asset, not as a resource or an input as it is currently seen, if we see it as a strategic asset that can support development in Africa, we can nurture it, invest in it, and grow it. So conservation ultimately needs to be about protecting animals and plants for people and not from people. We need to change the way that we think and talk about conservation. Many of you may have seen this graph. It's from the Descriptive Review of the Economics of Biodiversity in 2021, where he showed that since 1992, natural capital has declined as produced and human capital have grown at a global level. Africa can develop differently. We can ensure that we grow our natural capital along with our produced and human capital, aligning conservation and development sustainably. So I want each one of you to talk differently about conservation. We need to include conservation in the development narrative. We need to think of conservation as expansive, as growing, and to see nature being abundant and thriving, rather as seeing we need to protect these areas and they're completely threatened by development. There needs to be a change in the narrative. Mother Teresa said, if I look at the mass, I will never act, but if I look at the one, I will. And I think that's often what happens in the case of conservation, is we see all these figures, the doom and gloom. But don't forget that each one of you, every single one of you in this room, can make a difference every single day, even if you live in a city. So I want you to close your eyes again for me and picture you're waking up in the morning and you pull on your pair of denim jeans that needed 10,000 liters of water to grow the 1 kilogram of cotton that made up those jeans. And you put on your t-shirt that needed 2,700 liters of water to make. That's enough water for one person to drink for 900 days. And then you pick up your iPhone, you look at it, you see it's an iPhone 11, or you really want the iPhone 14. But remember all the resources that went into producing that. And think again before you decide to replace your jeans, before you decide to replace your t-shirt or your technology, because everything that we use every single day is dependent on nature in some way. And obviously, the air you breathe also is highly dependent on having sustainable forests. So please, be more aware of where your resources are coming from and how often you replace, reduce, reuse, recycle as much as possible. And let's include conservation much more in the development narrative. Conservation and development, aligning them sustainably, is not going to be easy. Trying to get people to see the new narrative where you can have conservation and development and that they are not mutually exclusive, but they are interlinked and dependent on one another, is not going to be easy. But we do hard things. And what if we did them differently?